Welcome. My name is Bob Tickelman, and we're going to start our Learning Path 1, Module 1, where we're going to take a look at Introduction to Active Directory Domain Services. At the heart of what a lot of this class is going to be around this topic, particularly around the exam itself. And so to understand ADDS, first of all, there's an understanding of the naming structure that we use. So we're going to take a look at defining what Active Directory Domain Services is, the different structure that it provides, and we'll take a look at the individual components that fit inside of it. I'm going to break off and draw a bunch of this stuff and know that I think that it helps to, for me at least, to start at the top and work down as opposed to jumping all over. So we're going to understand what a forest is and what the structure of that forest is. And then we're actually going to come back into the individual PowerPoint slides here and pages within your learning materials, and then we'll draw the analogies or the reference back to the story that I want to talk about. But I think it's important first and foremost to understand that what is Active Directory? And it's a registered trademark name for us, and we use it everywhere. You know, an analogy I talk to customers about all the time is it's like Kleenex. Kleenex is not a general thing. It's a product. It's a company that owns that. The term is called facial tissue. Then there's many other companies that do this. So Active Directory is Microsoft's registered trademark name that we use to label a bunch of different things. And so let's take a look at this progression that we had. There was originally this thing called workgroup computing, and whether it be NetWare, the earlier versions of NetWare, you take a look at LAN Manager and some of the products from Microsoft. Microsoft had a product called Windows for Workgroups. And so workgroup computing, I'm not going to go into all the technologies, but we then fundamentally changed that with a proprietary technology that Microsoft released with Windows NT 3.1. I've been working with this since the 1.x days, but 3.1 and more importantly 3.5 and 3.51 really became very popular because what it provided for was a central repository of a database of user accounts. So instead of having to have them distributed across a number of servers, we had this thing called a domain, and so you had these things called PDCs, or primary domain controllers, and BDC, backup domain controllers. And that really took off, and the industry really embraced the domain model. In 1999, to get around some of the limitations that we had of this proprietary product that we built with domains, Microsoft released Windows 2000, and so this is late 1999. And also to take it from a Microsoft proprietary technology, we implemented an industry standard X.500 LDAP-enabled directory. These are terms that you're going to see come in the books when we go back, or to the learning material when we go back to them. And so we called that implementation of this industry standard, we called it Active Directory Domain Services. And along with it came a bunch of other stuff. Active Directory Rights Management, Active Directory Federated Services, Active Directory Certificate Services. And so a whole bunch of features had that Active Directory name, but the one that was implemented the most in our customers was the Active Directory Domain Services. So everybody just called it Active Directory. But it became almost the industry standard. Like Kleenex was used to reference, the facial tissue. So, identity management, Active Directory became synonymous with that term. And that was great for about 10 years. So in 2008, with Windows Server 2008, in that release, we then started to use that name for something else. And at that point, we started to be very strict about it. Wasn't no longer just called Active Directory. We actually called it by its component, Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. And you're going to hear me use that term throughout all of these modules. Because what we did, because of that name familiarity with Active Directory, and everybody identified their corporate identities with that, we also came up with, and that was the start of our product of Azure, our cloud services, that fundamentally changed the way that identities were being managed and created. And it was based around an industry standard. The previous versions, Active Directory Domain Services, was based on a thing called Kerberos and NTLM. And a couple of other features, but those were the fundamental pieces. Well, with Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, the cloud-hosted, we came up with an industry standard. The industry came up with a standard of a thing called OpenID, OAuth, and OData, WSFed, and so there's all new protocols of that were used, but we still called it Azure Active Directory. And so Active Directory Domain Services was used to represent our on-premises legacy components and Azure Active Directory. So people still talked about, oh, I got Active Directory, and I go, well, which one? They go, I got Active Directory. It's said, well, there's multiple versions, because in fact, while we have Active Directory Domain Services for your on-premises, we have a cloud version called Azure Active Directory. We've got a tool that we use, and we're going to talk about it in this delivery, well, not this one, in a future module. We have a tool called AD Connect that is used to connect these two directory services and synchronize them. We also have a tool that spins off of Azure Active Directory. It has the capability of having a thing called Azure Active Directory Domain Services, where this was just called ADDS. This one's called AADDS. I always feel like I'm stuttering. So when you think of the term Active Directory, I'm going to look at you and say, well, which one? Because we have, in this case, at least 4 instances of things that leverage that term Active Directory. So at the end of the day, what was Active Directory Domain Services in all of its iterations in the on-premises world that we want to take a look at? Now, if any of you are familiar with databases, there is, in a file called, if I use SQL, a file called an MDF, or the master database file. Inside of that file is a series of tables. And those tables are made up of columns and rows. And each of you might have a customers table, you might have a products table, you might have an orders table. So you've got all these different tables, and in that table, so I'm going to blow up the customers table, you've got the customer number as a column, and it's going to say the customer number is numeric, and it might be up to 10 characters. You then get the customer name, cust name, and that's going to be alpha plus numeric and maybe to 128 characters. You got the customer address. Might be a field within the customer table, and the field might be address is alpha plus numeric to, say, 35 characters, whatever it is. That term is referred to collectively as a thing called a schema. A schema defines all of the attributes and their characteristic. Are they alphanumeric? How long are they? What kind of things can go in them? And those attributes then make up a collection of objects. So an object like a customer is made up of the attribute of a customer name, a customer number. So that term called a schema has been used in the database world for a long time. And I wanted to do that just as a background here, because we're going to take a look at Active Directory Domain Services and what it needs. So when you install or configure a Windows Server to be a domain controller in this thing called a forest, and so we're going to start with the term called a forest. And a forest is your implementation of our product, Active Directory Domain Services. And so you're going to get a thing called the default schema. So there's one of the first things. A forest has a one-to-one relationship with a thing called the schema. And as I just described, a schema is going to be a definition of all the tables and all the objects and all the characteristics of those objects within this database that we're going to build. And so when you build your first domain, and we use that term, so you could start off with a first domain. Maybe I'll use some colors in here. I'll build it as green. So my first domain is going to start to put entries into this database that we have for our forest. Now this first domain takes on special characteristics. It's called the forest root domain. And it anchors the creation of your forest. And it starts building this database that we have. Now we're going to call this, say, contoso.com. And so that also now becomes synonymous with the name of the forest. So the first domain in the forest is the forest root domain, and whatever name you use to provide for that FQDN name becomes the name of the forest itself. You then start to build this file called an ntds.dit file. Now, using the same analogy back to my master database file for SQL, I am going to have this file called ntds.dit, and inside of it is going to be several components. And you're going to hear us use the terms called partitions shortly. Inside of that database, we are going to have what is called the schema partition. That schema partition is going to have all the definition of all the objects that we're going to be able to have in this forest. There's a partition called the config partition that talks about the configuration of the objects in your forest. So we have a config partition in this file called ntds.dit. And then you're going to get a partition called the domain partition. And I'm going to draw this as green because it's for the green domain. And inside of that partition is going to be all the records for the domain that it represents. And so you're going to create a green domain controller, and it's going to be the first domain controller in there, and it's going to get a series of different characteristics. It's going to have a copy of this file on it, and it's going to start to take on certain characteristics. There's some user accounts and group accounts, as well as things called FSMO roles that we're going to cover in a future module that get installed on that first domain controller. Now, one of the things that Active Directory Domain Services did is moving away from that legacy technology from previously, it started to move into a thing called a multi-master replication model that now allowed for every domain controller to have a read-write copy of this database that keeps track of our records. Now, it is strongly recommended that you have multiple domain controllers, and so you can have multiple domain controllers that now have copies of this ntds.dit file that has a record of all the users and all the computers and all the information in this domain. Now, you can have the choice, and theoretically, you can have hundreds of thousands, even millions of records inside of a single domain. And it used to be the recommendation where we talk about most forests should start off with a single domain structure. Now, many customers had this legacy domain model that they've been working with using that legacy technology, and they wanted to split off production from sales and Europe from North America and Asia. So they had all these different domains. So they might have wanted to have multi-domains because all these domain controllers in the domain talk to each other and replicated this information. And so you're going to see when we go back to the books, they're going to talk about a domain is a unit of replication. Because maybe all my users in Europe, I don't need to replicate that information to the domain controllers here in North America. So maybe I want to optimize that replication and separate the two of them. So I could do that. So I'm now going to create a different domain. So I'm going to create, I hate to do red, but if you don't mind, I'm going to create a red domain. And I'm going to call this emea.contoso.com. So now we're forming a thing called a tree. A tree is a group of domains that share a common namespace. And so child domains of a parent domain inherit the parent's name and then add its unique name to that namespace. So we have emea.contoso.com. And if I had children domain below emea, I could have, different domains down here if I needed to, and they would have, I'd call this maybe Spain.emea.contoso.com. I could have France.emea.contoso, and so I would have all these different domains. Now, several things also come in here. Between the domains, there becomes this term called a trust. And a trust creates a relationship between the two domains that says, I know who your users are, and I trust them to come use my resources. They're still my resources, and I'm going to control what they can do with them, but I trust you with your users. If you tell me that you've authenticated them, I will allow them to gain access to resources in my domain. but I'm going to be able to control what they can do. And vice versa. My users, if I authenticate them, you will trust them and you can control what they do. So this is called a two-way trust. Now, in this tree that we've just built, this trust is two ways, and the term is called transitive, so that if I have a red user down here in Spain that gets authenticated by a domain controller in Spain, we could theoretically gain access to any resource, whether it be file and print servers or whether it be files, resources, whatever it is. They could potentially gain resources anywhere within this structure that we had. Two ways, transitive trust in a parent-child relationship. Taking this on a bit further, you could potentially have multiple trees inside of your forest. Now, going back just one more thing before I go into that, within the green domain, we had a green container, but I'm going to go into red domain here. Red domain now also has the ntds.dit file. It's going to have the schema container, because remember there's a one-to-one relationship, so it's going to have a schema container, a listing of all the objects that can be in that domain. We have the config container, because it's the same as on every domain controller, so I got a config container. I should have thought about this ahead of time. And it's going to have a domain container, but it's going to be unique to the red domain. So its domain portion is going to be only the list of objects in the red domain for this case. And maybe I should draw these ones down here as different colors, just so I don't mix it up with red. Go into, and do this one as orange, kind of reddish, and I'm going to do this one as, what color should I use? I'll do it as black. So the red domain has its own container of its objects. Now all of its domain controllers will have the red domain and replicate all of its users, but it knows nothing about any of the other domain's users in the other domain. That's why we have to have these trust relationships. So all of these terms I've just introduced, what a forest is, what a schema is, what a trust relationship is by default in a parent-child two-way transitive trust. We now know that we have different containers to store this information. Now, this becomes a problem because how do I know that in green domain, I know what my users are, how do I know what a red user is so that I can grant them access to my resources? Red can authenticate them, but I don't even know who they are. And so there's a term called a global catalog. Now, in this model, the green domain controllers know everything that there is to know about the green users. The red domains know everything there is about the red domain users. But the global catalog provides a little bit of information about all users in the forest. So the global catalog, or what's called a GC, has a little bit of information from all users in the forest. It knows a little bit about red users. It maybe knows their first name, last name, and a thing called a SID. Maybe it just knows that. It knows a little bit about the green users. It knows a little bit about the green users. It knows the same three things. It knows a little bit, and which domain they're from, I should say. It knows a little bit about yellow and orange. So it knows something about all of these users a little bit. That way, if someone says, hey, I'm green user, it goes, I don't know anything about you. Where did you come from? It can look that information up into the global catalog. So here's these different terms we've been talking about. Domain controllers are basically all the same within the same domain. They are a unit of replication between each other, and they know everything about the objects in its domain. We have trust relationships joining multiple domains together in a parent-child relationship to create this thing called a tree that shares a common namespace. We've got a global catalog server that has a little bit of information about all objects within the forest that you're working with. Now there's one other one that we have, is I could have another tree in here that I could add to this model. I'm going to draw a purple line in here. I could have a whole new tree that starts a new namespace. And so we could call this like Fabricam.com, and it can have child domains that it's working with, and they would inherit their parent namespace, and that would be a multi-tree forest that are connected back to this root forest root domain in the forest root tree. So all of those terms kind of come together in this plane of what is domain controllers. And so we're going to go back to the books here, or the learning material, and you'll see that there's paragraphs of information, but hopefully that gives you this idea holistically of this file called ntds.dit. It's on all the domain controllers. The ntds.dit is going to vary from domain to domain because while they have a common schema and config, they might have a unique domain partition within it that is going to store that information. That is that unit of replication. It's also called a security boundary because from a security perspective, it is responsible for authenticating and authorizing green users in the green domain. The domain container for the domain controllers for red domain is responsible for doing that security authentication of the red users. So all of these terms of units of replication, units of security boundaries, trust relationships are core to what it is that we need to have from a discussion about Active Directory domain services. And so you're seeing some of these terms. If you go to the learning materials, the term partitions and schemas, what are domains and domain trees? What is that forest? And if I were to, just go through the books, it would be hard to understand. But remember, there is this one-to-one relationship between a forest and a schema that has a one-to-one relationship. A forest is made up of a grouping of one or more domain trees, and a domain tree is made up of one or more domains that shares a common namespace. Now, there's a couple of terms on here we haven't talked about yet, sites and OUs and containers. I'll get to those in just a few minutes. But the domain controllers themselves are those units that take on this special responsibility of managing the domains in the forest. So we've got this term called domain controllers. We no longer have that relationship of PDCs and BDCs. All domain controllers have read-write copies. They all can make changes, and there's a thing called a unit of replication and replication conflict. I'm not going to get into it. This was normally part of a 5-day class. So we've got data stores that are in there. Those are the partitions we were talking about. I've mentioned this term called a global catalog server. Remember, domain controllers have all the information about the objects that it controls in its domain. The global catalog is a little bit of information about all objects in the forest. And so you're going to see why this is important as we talk about some of the recommendations as we get later into this module. Now, when you take a look at the RODCs, are the read-only domain controllers. By default, all domain controllers have a read-write copy of the database information that they work with. Well, you might want to put a domain controller into a location that you're not that comfortable with from a security perspective. I had a customer that was a property management firm globally, and they managed a little over 1,200 malls and shopping locations around the world. And they varied in size from very, very large to pretty small. And some had big offices with many people in them, and some had only a small office with a few people in it. And so for those offices, they put these read-only domain controllers in there so that they had access to authentication in some of the services locally, but they didn't have the security around what you would have in a data center in their main offices. And so in case of that device being compromised or actually being stolen, it would make it much more secure because being a read-only domain controller, it can't feed information back into the replication model. So you can't, artificially seed or poison the domain information by, compromising that machine and, replicating it back. Also, it was secured and locked down, hopefully encrypted, so that if it was taken, people wouldn't have that information. So RODCs are an important part in the design and the deployment of these domain controllers. So typically we look at DCs as a group and treat them the same, and then these RODCs become these offshoots that we could put into those areas that we might not be as comfortable putting a read-write copy of our information into. Now, I'll come back to the sites and OUs and containers in just a little bit, but we want to take a look at this thing called the different types of accounts that we're dealing with. And it's because we have this thing called a SID, or a secure ID. And every object in the domain is going to get this thing called a SID. And it looks something like the number you see at the bottom of the screen, S-1-5. And you get this thing called a sub-authority value. It's 128 bits. And It is sometimes referred to as the domain SID because all the objects within the domain will share that number in common. So all of these users would have some number in common that ties them together as domain members, and they would share that number in that relationship. The same things with groups, and we have a variety of different types of groups that we're going to take a look at. There's things called global groups, domain local groups, and universal groups. And there's a whole nesting model that Microsoft recommends. Some of you might have heard of a term called AGDLP. Accounts go into global groups, AG. Global groups go into domain local groups, DL. And domain local groups are assigned permissions. And so we have this recommended model for the using of these different groups, and groups again have SID values that represent them from being from the domain that they were created, as well as all the Windows class operating systems that we had available to us. They could be potentially domain members. They would get a domain account that represented that computer's identity within the domain. And what they do is they share this number, but they all get this thing called a RID, or a relative identifier. This is a 32-bit number that you do not ever reuse numbers. So let's say, for example, I had a Bob account here, and Bob was, S-1-5-21, this long number, and he was 11271. That was his RID that went through and identified the Bob account. Now, you could rename Bob to Robert if you wanted, because that happens a lot. People change names. And so now he knows his account name as Robert, but the system doesn't care what you call yourself. The RID stays exactly the same for that object. And this becomes an important part because if you deleted the user account intentionally or accidentally, you could absolutely recreate a user account, call it Robert, and think that it had the same username and password, but it's going to get a different RID because you cannot reuse RIDs. And so it would get the next number in sequence. And so all of this information, not really talked about in the books a bunch, but it's going to give you a framework of other topics that we're going to cover in other modules about doing things called authoritative restores, and how do you use the recycle bin, and what is the mark for deletion using an RIP All of these concepts are going to be used or needed for the management of your domain and your forest, but here's hopefully an understanding or a description of what those topics are. This slide is not in your materials. I've added it in for you. So falling back into the course material, you can see that we've got a definition, and there's paragraphs in the learning material. If you go back, I've described most of this for you, and you'll see that my language is very close to what they talk about. What is a domain? What is a forest? What's a tree? Now, we know what a forest is. We know what a domain is. And so what we have is, the forest being the outer reaches that we have our trees, and within the trees you have our domains. Those become pretty hard boundaries. But within a domain, you might have hundreds of thousands, even millions of objects between group accounts and user accounts and computer accounts. Wouldn't it be nice if there was some way that I could organize those objects in an administrative model? There's absolutely groupings of users that are maybe HR users and HR managers, and there's sales users and sales managers, and then there's an all managers group that have the sales managers and HR managers. And all of that is going to go through from an organizational perspective of your personnel. But from a management feature from Active Directory Domain Services, this is where OUs come into place. And so if domains were security boundaries and units of replication, OUs become this logical grouping that you have from an administrator's perspective, that you can now create a parent-child relationship with inside of your domain. And there is a parent-child relationship, and so you can have an OU for your entire domain, and then below that you can have, if I didn't split up based on domains, I could have EMEA versus the Americas as two child OUs if they were in the same domain. And then I could administer them differently, because I'm going to show you later on in a different module a thing called a group policy object that can be assigned to an OU. So an OU becomes this flexible way for you to be able to manage the objects inside of a domain. When we go in and take a look at the graphical interface, there's this thing called a container. It's kind of like an OU with the exception that you can't assign group policies to it. So if you had objects that needed to be managed and grouped together, but didn't need to have group policies applied to them, you could put them into a container. And so it just becomes another object within this database structure of Active Directory domain services that allows us to partition and manage our user or our information in that model. User accounts are a key piece to this, and so if you were to take a look at the schema, and I'm going to go in and show you some of these, a user is a class of users, an object that is made up of a series of attributes, and there's a whole series of tabs. And so as I mentioned, there's a first name attribute. And in that database model, the first name says it could be alphanumeric characters to X number of characters in length. I get its middle name, last name, what are their phone numbers, what is their display name, what is their email address. All of these are the attributes defined in the schema that when you start filling them out, make up the record of a user account. Now remember that user account is going to have a SID that is going to represent the domain portion and the relative ID portion of that identity within the domain that you're working with. There's a wide range of attributes you can put on them. There's literally hundreds of them. There's some custom attributes. The books don't talk about it, but you could potentially extend your schema. You could add attributes to the schema that you could then use to define on different records across the forest itself. Now, eye-winking moment, and an important thing to note, you've got to be super careful about modifying the schema. We used to have recommendations that said, don't modify the schema, and people didn't. But then we said, oh no, by the way, you can, because if you're going to want to use Exchange, you need to modify the schema. So, there's lots of documentation about how proper ways to modify the schema, because once you do, if you add something to it, you can't delete it or you can't change it. So if you make a mistake, and I actually had this happen to a customer, they went in a telephony world, they added an attribute to a record. And then they went out and bought a major third-party vendor for voice over IP, and that product needed that same attribute. They called it the same thing. How they came up with that was quite accidental. But they had identified this attribute to be only 12 characters in length. And when you take a look at these international telephone companies that have voice over IP products, they think about numbers at a global level. And 12 numbers was not enough, because if you take a look at international dialing, it needed more characters. And so they couldn't install that company's product because that attribute couldn't be modified and it was already being used, and it would restrict its capability. So it caused a real big problem for them to be able to get this product installed. So, bit of a side angle, but be very careful when you start taking a look at the schema and modifying it, and you'll see why we have some recommendations later in the modules for this course that says you should protect the schema. There's this thing called the schema administrators that should be locked down and be very protected that you're dealing with. We then also have group objects, and going back to that AG DL, these are two types of groups, global groups and domain local groups, because how you manage objects should not be done at the user level. And we're going to show you, and I'll draw you an example of this AGDLP is the best way to work with it. And so the groups themselves fall into two categories. They can be called security groups or distribution groups. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the distribution group could be for an email account within Exchange. Well, you got to be careful, because I don't want to use it for security. So you can classify, when you create the group, you can say what kind of a group it is. Is it a security group or a distribution group? And what is its scope? Because the scope is going to say what it can be used in. For example, a global group, I'm going to go back to my example here. A global group in this model, come on. Oh, you know where it is? Wrong. It was in the end here. A global group from Green Domain. So if I created a global group in Green Domain, maybe I should do it as green. A global group can only have membership from the domain in which it was created. but it can be used through any trusted domain. Remember these trust relationships. So I always talk it like it's like your local tour provider. A local tour provider can only manage people in the city that it's working with, but it can send you on tours potentially anywhere in the world, and so it has access to. So a global group can only have memberships from the domain it's in, but it can be used in any domain that is trusted by in this case, the global group's domain. Now, a domain local group, I'll go to purple here. So a domain local group defined in purple can have any object within the domain added to it or any trusted object. So it can take users or global groups from other domains, but it can only be used in the domain that was created. So using my example, I am here in Seattle. I would go to a Seattle travel agent, say I need to book a trip into the Mediterranean, and they say, okay, well, I'll put you into this group and we're going to send you to the Mediterranean and you're going to go on this cruise ship. So that cruise ship only sails in the Mediterranean. It can't go anywhere in the world. So this is that kind of relationship that domain local groups can have membership from any trusted domain and its own domain, but can only be used in its domain, where global groups can only have memberships from its domain, but can be used anywhere. And so they're almost inverses of each other. So there's all these different rules that we have about group memberships to be able to nest this stuff. So there's that group nesting model. Again, this is not in the course material, so we talk about AGDLP, where users get assigned to global groups from their domain. Global groups can be nested into other global groups, but then they can be nested into domain local groups in either their domain or any trusted domain. Now, another type of group, and this came later in the life cycle of Active Directory domain services, was this term called a universal group. A universal group can have membership from any trusted domain, and it can be used in any trusted domain. So people would say, well, that's perfect. Why don't I use that for everything? Well, it was about 6 years after we started this, so people already built this old AGDLP model, but also there's a performance impact potentially at the global catalog level. And so while it might seem like the best solution, I don't have time to get into it today, global groups or universal groups are great, but there's a cost that come with them. It's kind of like that life lesson that you have, that anytime I give you something, I'm going to take something away. There's also computer objects, because just like user accounts, we can control computers as an identity, because a user on an account, computer, the two of them might need access, both needing access to information, because Bob on a secure device in a secure location is different than Bob on his phone in an unsecure location. So that combination really gave us that capability to secure information. So what is a domain? Here's the book learning pieces that talks about a domain, units of replication. It's for authentication and authorization. Hopefully that the book learning pieces or the course material lines up with the concepts that I've talked to you about. It talks about Active Directory forests. So again, you can see it's in a slightly different order. A forest is your implementation, and you start with the first forest root domain by putting the first domain controller in that forest root domain. It is you have child domains that you can work with, and there's the two-way transitive trust. You can have multiple trees. So in here, the forest is this box. And so we've now got multiple domains in there. And so there's trust relationships that we have. And there's internal trusts that are two ways and transitive, as well as we have a series of external trusts. I could create what's called a shortcut trust. If you have this very complex model where you've got child domains that come down quite a ways, to traverse the trust relationship to be able to gain access to a resource over here, it could have an impact on performance. So I could create this thing called a shortcut trust, and we've got a list of what those things will look like coming up. We talked about OUs. OUs are a type of a grouping of objects within your forest, and you can see they have a very specific look to them as opposed to just a container object. And we can now group our objects, and they can inherit features, and GPOs, group policy objects, can be assigned them, but not to the containers themselves. We've got a variety of tools to manage this. We've got some RSAT tools, the remote server administrative tools. You can install them on your workstation. They're installed by default. They use bottom set. of Active Directory users or computers, sites and services, domains and trusts are a set of what are called MMCs, or Microsoft Management Consoles. We can do all of this by installing the PowerShell modules for Active Directory domain services. We've got that RSAT tools where you can install them onto like a Windows workstation if you were to administer this remotely. And we're going to be taking a look quite a bit at the Windows Admin Center as an HTML or a web-based single pane of glass to manage not just Active Directory domain services, but a wide variety of services that are going to be supported by a device that you want to manage. So with that, that's a quick introduction to Active Directory and its life cycles that it has and the major components that you have for the building of your Active Directory domain services environment. So be with me, use the proper name. It's Active Directory Domain Services for your on-premises authentication and authorization of your identity objects. So let's take a quick look at some of the review questions. So what scope of group can be assigned permissions anywhere in the ADDS forest and can have memberships anywhere in the ADD forest? So we've got global, universal, or domain local. And that would have been the universal groups. Remember, global can only have memberships from its domain, so it can't have memberships from anywhere, but it can be used in any trusted domain. And domain local groups can have memberships from anywhere, but only used in the domain in which it was created. What type of trust relationship is automatically created between the domains, in this case contoso.com and seattle.contoso.com? They're assuming that it's a parent-child relationship, and that would be that parent-child two-way transitive trust. So which of the following is a built-in object in Active Directory domain services that can hold computer objects? Now, it's a bit of a language thing here. So what kind of object? An object can either be a user account, a group account, a container, or a GPO. But a system account, or a system, that's not there by default. The ITOU can be created after the fact. So these two are not there. So the only one that is there by default is the domain controller's OU. So with that, that brings module number 1 of Learning Path 1 to a close, an introduction to Active Directory domain services. We look forward to hopefully seeing you in a future module. Thanks very much, and have a great day.